Throughout the evening, I intermittently noticed a pair of men lingering in a booth. One of them occasionally ventured to other tables, while the other nursed his drink. Typically, he approached tables occupied by women, engaging in brief conversations that sometimes ended swiftly, while other times he produced an envelope containing documents or pictures, their contents unclear to me. I assumed they were engaged in some sort of sales, finding it surprising that the management hadn't intervened. Later that night, I mentioned this observation to my companions, my wife Christy, our friends Chris and his wife Liz, and Heinz and his wife Kim. We briefly speculated about their activities before moving on. About 30 minutes later, the first man finally approached our table. I presumed he had exhausted his options with tables occupied predominantly by women, and we were about to learn what was going on. He greeted us, asking how we were all doing tonight, his tone friendly. Our responses were muddled, and he smiled at each of us before continuing, explaining that his friend, who was in town for the weekend on business, was looking for some company and wanted to see if any of the ladies might be interested. I was taken aback by his audacity to approach a table where each woman was clearly accompanied by her partner and ask if they'd be interested in accompanying his friend for lovemaking. I was about to express my thoughts when Liz spoke up, questioning his proposition. The man responded, explaining that his friend was well endowed and knew how to use it, suggesting that one of us might be interested in giving it a try. At this point, the women were barely holding back laughter, but he seemed oblivious, perhaps immune to rejection. Kim took the next step, likely sparking the events that followed, and asked how they could know he was really that well-equipped. The man retrieved the familiar envelope he had been carrying all evening, revealing several pictures of his friend confirming his claim. At this juncture, the men among us were content to let the women handle the situation, eagerly anticipating the moment this individual would be sent away. The women, visibly impressed by the pictures, reacted with exaggerated enthusiasm while Chris, Heinz, and I observed with amusement at their antics. Then came the big proposition. So what do you say, ladies? Any takers? You won't regret it. Liz and Kim shook their heads, giggling as they returned the pictures to the man, who then stowed them back in the envelope. It seemed he was about to leave and try his luck elsewhere when he paused, focusing on Christy. Perhaps he noticed something familiar in her eyes as he made a point of asking her again, "Oh, what about you, little lady? I didn't see you shake your head." I sat there confidently, though in hindsight, foolishly waiting for Christy to confront the guy. When she finally spoke, I was more focused on his response than on her words. To my surprise, he didn't frown or remain composed. Instead, he grinned widely and walked over to Christy. It took a moment for me to register her saying, "I'll go." By the time I regained my composure, he had already taken her from the table and was leading her toward the exit. I couldn't tell if there was a signal or if the second guy just understood, but he was already heading for the door too. Our friend seemed as shocked as I was, attempting to say something to Christy but no sound came out. Despite my shock, I managed to act, grabbing Christy's arm and pulling her away from him before they reached the door. I questioned the bouncer's actions, asking what he was doing, but then a massive hand, attached to the largest arm I'd ever seen, grabbed mine, forcing me to release Christy. I protested, telling him that Christy was my wife and that I was just trying to prevent her from leaving with those guys. Despite my protests, the bouncer maintained his grip, asserting his authority over the situation. He expressed regret for whatever was happening in my marriage, but emphasized his duty to prevent violence. According to him, since Christy claimed she was leaving with them willingly, he couldn't allow me to touch her like that on their property. Even as he held me, Christy whispered something in his ear, prompting him to give her a strange look before glancing back at me and then at her again. He asked her if she was sure about her decision. Christy looked back at me, then seemed to gather her resolve, affirming her decision to the bouncer with newfound confidence. After Christy walked towards the waiting men by the door, I desperately called out for her to stop and come back, but she didn't hesitate. I could only watch as she joined the two men and left through the door. I assumed the bouncer would release me once they were gone, allowing me to chase after them. However, when I tried to pull away after the door closed, I found myself still firmly restrained. I protested, asking why he was still holding me since they were off the property. I struggled against him, but it was futile. Finally, I stopped and looked at him with resignation. Apologizing for the situation, he explained that Christy had asked him to hold me for a few more minutes so I couldn't follow them. And technically, the parking lot was still their property. The realization that Christy had voluntarily left with the two men and asked the bouncer to restrain me drained all fight from me. Our friends stood nearby, still in shock at the turn of events. After a couple of minutes, the bouncer released my arm, and I collapsed onto the floor, feeling defeated. I briefly caught a look of pity on the bouncer's face before he walked away. The bar had fallen silent during the ordeal, and as the drama ended, peripheral conversations gradually resumed. I sat on the floor, devastated, tears streaming down my face. How could she do this? Wasn't I enough for her? The painful realization gave me something tangible to act upon. Chris and Hines helped me stand and guided me back to our table, where Kim and Liz tried to comfort me after Christy's abandonment and humiliation. However, when I saw Christy's empty seat, I felt determined. I left a $40 tip on the table and made my way to the door. Kim asked if I was leaving, to which I replied that there was no reason for me to stay and that I had things to do. Liz asked about waiting for Christy's return, but I dismissed the idea, suggesting that one of them offer her shelter for the night instead. I felt the need to leave. As I walked away, I heard the girls asking the guys to intervene, but they refused, stating, "No way, not after what she did." I focused on the door, avoiding the pity from everyone in the bar. I managed to reach my car before being overwhelmed by emotions again. Feeling dizzy and on the verge of passing out, I sat in the driver's seat for several minutes until I felt well enough to drive home. As I sat there, I reflected on the irony that Christy's impulsive nature had once attracted me to her. About halfway back to our apartment, Christy's number appeared on my caller ID. Assuming she had changed her mind and needed help, I answered the call without pleasantries and went straight to offering assistance. However, I was mistaken. I asked where Christy was and offered to come get her, asking for the hotel and room number. Sensing she didn't want me to go to the room, I adjusted my approach, suggesting she escape and I would pick her up outside. She explained that she wasn't leaving and wanted to stay, calling me baby and hoping for my understanding. She emphasized it wasn't about me or her love for me, but something she needed to do. I pleaded with her to reconsider, but she insisted she had to go through with it, promising it wouldn't hurt us and it was just one time. At this point, I felt numb. Not only had she walked out on me in front of our friends and an entire bar, but now she called me to rub it in and had the audacity to ask if I was okay with it. I couldn't believe she was treating me like this. I realized there was nothing worth fighting for, so I told her I understood, though I meant it far differently than she thought. She sounded excited and thanked me, promising to show me how much she loved me once she was done with that. The call ended, and all the sadness and depression I was feeling suddenly dissipated. I had blocked out the love I had for her just a few hours before, replaced by a grim determination to move on. Upon reaching my apartment, I unpacked my luggage. We each had our own set from before we were married, and I spread all 3 suitcases out on the bed. We didn't have much stuff, and what was mine was far less than Christy's. I believed it would all fit in these 3 cases, but if not, I was pretty sure anything I needed to leave behind wouldn't be missed. I took my time. I had no intention of simply disappearing. In fact, I was looking forward to her feeling as much pain when I walked out the apartment door as I felt when she walked out of the bar, and she would have to be here for me to experience that. I had 2 suitcases completely full and was midway through the last one when I heard the front door open and then shut quietly. I guess she saw the lights were on, so knew I was awake, and she called to me. I called out for her to have a good time, though apparently my sarcasm wasn't clear given her response sounded like she had just returned from a party. She entered the bedroom, and I stole a glance at her. Her hair and makeup were disheveled, and her clothes looked rumpled. She appeared satisfied, but her smile quickly vanished upon seeing me packing. She questioned what I was doing, and I replied that I was moving out and filing for divorce. She approached me, trying to stop my packing, but I firmly removed her hand from the suitcase, feeling a surge of anger, reminiscent of the bouncer gripping my arm. I told her not to touch me and clarified that what I understood was that she was going to enjoy with those guys regardless of my feelings. I asked if she had been with both men, not just Mr. Big. My sarcasm was evident. She pleaded with me not to leave, explaining that she had always wanted to try someone that big and had never been with a well-endowed man before. She justified her actions by saying it wouldn't have been fair to leave Desmond hanging after he did most of the work and that she wouldn't want him to prey on married women to suffer. She assured me it was over and that she was mine forever, willing to do anything to make it up to me. I expressed my disappointment to Christy, reminding her that she had already promised to be mine forever when we got married. I questioned the significance of her promise now, considering she had already broken it once. I asked how she could possibly make up for what she had done and expressed my feelings of inadequacy. Despite this, I told her I would consider putting it behind us if she told me the hotel and room number where they took her. Christy refused to tell me and continued packing. She dismissed my request, telling me to take a printout of her apology and shove it. She expressed concern that if she told me where they were, I might do something dangerous and get hurt since there were two of them. She insisted they weren't worth getting into trouble over. I countered, asserting that it was my decision to make, not hers. I asked her one more time for the hotel and room number. She apologized again, citing her promise to protect me when we got married. She refused to let me get hurt unless I was the one doing the hurting. My response seemed to strike a chord with her, and she finally relented. I finished packing as Christy continued to try to convince me to stay with her, though she no longer physically stopped me. Despite her attempts to reassure me that it was just lovemaking and something she had to do, claiming she loved only me, I remained resolute in my decision to leave. When she finally said it meant nothing, I had reached my limit. I told her firmly that it did mean something to me. Our lovemaking life was very precious to me. I didn't realize it meant so little to you, but it was one of the things that made you special, that I was the only one that got to experience your body, and you just gave it away. And not only that, you did it in the most humiliating way possible. We were out with our best friends, for God's sake. She apologized, saying she knew and swearing it would never happen again, explaining that she had gone a little crazy, but now it was out of her system. I questioned what else there could be, what she meant by that, and what else she might have to try one day. I expressed disbelief and shame at what she had done, recounting how the entire bar had stared at me with pity and shame as she walked out without even looking back at me. She openly cried, pleading with me not to leave her and professing her love for me. I responded firmly, saying that if that was how she expressed love, I wasn't interested. I admitted that even if she had told me where to find them, there was no way I was going to stay. I told her I might forgive her one day, but I would never forget what she did and how it made me feel. It took 2 trips, but I got my suitcases loaded into my car and drove away. When I went back the second time, Christy was still collapsed on the floor. All she could manage was to look up at me as I came in and mumbled, please, please don't go, baby, please." Despite what had happened, what she had done, I still felt like a complete idiot leaving like this. It didn't cause me to reconsider, but I still felt bad. I assumed that was because while there was no way I could still be with her, I still sure as hell still loved her. I was disoriented when I woke up in the hotel. I had been more tired than I thought. I guess the adrenaline wore off, and once it did, I crashed hard. It was nearly noon before I woke up. Fortunately, I had paid for 2 days in advance, but I knew my bank account wouldn't support a hotel stay for long. I needed a place to stay. One problem was the 3 months left on the lease of the apartment Christy and I had shared. There certainly wasn't enough to pay for that and a new apartment, so I'd have to decide whether or not to just take the hit and abandon the apartment or come up with some other plan. The fact was that Christy and I had very little in terms of assets. We each had a car in our names and payments to go with them, so that was likely a wash. The bank account was small, and beyond that was just the furniture we had bought, and I didn't particularly care for it. I didn't hate it, I just didn't care. I hated to put any of the other couples into the middle of things, but Chris and Heinz had been my best friends for years, predating all of our wives. Chris and Liz had been married for 5 years, Heinz and Kim for almost 4. Christy and I had been the last ones to join that particular club. After finally turning my phone back on, I found numerous messages from Christy and several from the guys and their wives, mostly urging me not to do anything rash. One message from Chris stood out, offering to help in any way they could. I called them and got Liz on the phone, asking for marital sanctuary. Liz proposed a deal. I could stay in their guest room for a while, but she wouldn't hide me from Christy. She mentioned that Christy had been asking everyone if they had heard from me. Liz insisted that I be at least civil to Christy, acknowledging that she had made a mistake but emphasizing that it wasn't as serious as homicide. I agreed to Liz's terms and spent the next morning moving from the hotel to their spare room. My boss allowed me to take the morning off, but I had to work late one evening that week to compensate. I decided to work late that night to distract myself from the weekend's events. I arrived at Chris and Liz's house close to 10 o'clock, hoping for some rest, but I was met with an unexpected encounter with Christy. I questioned her presence, reminding her that I didn't want to see her when I left. She apologized, explaining that she was hurting without me and expressing a desire to talk and work things out. I reiterated that I wasn't interested in reconciling, but she pleaded with me not to end things because of one mistake. She professed our love and pleaded for a chance to make things right. I reminded her of the opportunity she had to salvage my dignity by telling me where those guys were but refused. I told her I needed space to figure out my feelings. She begged me not to give up on our future, admitting her mistake. I emphasized the severity of her actions and asked her to leave so I could process. Christy left with a lowered head after a brief exchange with Liz in the kitchen. I stayed in the living room while they spoke. Afterward, Christy left, pausing briefly at the door to tell me she loved me before departing. My resolve weakened, and I sank onto the couch. Liz sat beside me while Chris stood in the hallway. Liz commended me for handling the situation well and thanked me for being as kind as I was, acknowledging that it wasn't easy. I expressed my frustration, feeling that I didn't deserve what had happened. Liz agreed, saying that I shouldn't have to suffer like this, even though it was Christy's fault. She mentioned that Christy was also suffering, as she hadn't expected me to leave her over this. I asked if Christy had planned this, considering how much she could get away with. Liz clarified that Christy only considered that after the fact. I inquired about what Christy had told her. Liz explained that Christy had mentioned the temptation of being with someone well-endowed as the reason for her actions. She assured me that Christy hadn't planned for me to be held back by the bouncer. This revelation angered me. Was the love-making at least terrible? Do you want me to sugarcoat it or be honest? I guess that answers the question. Never mind. But Henry, as satisfying as she claims it was, she insists she would never trade what you two have for that. It was just one time and it meant nothing to her compared to what she had with you. But she did trade me for that. She didn't realize that's what she was doing. Well, we all make choices, and when we do, we choose the consequences, even if we don't anticipate them. You're right. But afterward, when she reflected on her actions, she still believed you two could move past it. She thought if she treated it casually, you'd eventually forgive her. Kim and I hoped so too, but Chris and Hines both disagreed. I guess they were right. They know me well, Liz. I can't see any way past this. She was deliberate in her actions, leaving right in front of me and having me restrained so she could escape. Then she called me to try to gain my approval. She had numerous opportunities to see that I wasn't okay with this, and she chose against me every time. I understand it may seem that way, but she wasn't thinking clearly. It was like a moment of temporary insanity. Haven't you ever experienced something similar where you lost sight of the consequences? Liz, I appreciate you standing up for her. I know you two have become close friends, and I wouldn't expect anything less. You're my friend too, Henry, and I understand how much you care for her. Nevertheless, this situation isn't comparable to when I stayed up all night playing video games instead of doing a history essay. We're adults, and it's evident that her actions would lead to the outcome we're facing now. You're correct, but my heart tells me you two are great together and suggests that if you forgive her, you could be happy. And maybe you're right, Liz, but more likely, I'd spend my time worrying about what might happen next. I'd be hesitant to go to a club again, fearing a repeat incident. If she can't control her impulses, am I supposed to accept that she made her decision, and now I have to prioritize my well-being? Excuse me, I'm tired and need some sleep. The rest of the story with Christy follows a predictable path. I'll acknowledge her efforts to reconcile, but I remained resistant. It was tough because I still loved her. When you divorce, you don't just lose a spouse, you lose all the dreams, plans, and hopes you shared. We discussed children, grandchildren, travel, and starting a family. Now those aspirations were shattered. It was during these moments that the desire to stay together was strongest. Christy and I were in sync regarding our dreams, like we were two halves of a whole. However, I couldn't overlook her actions. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. Christy asked for one last conversation with no conditions attached. I agreed to listen. After the hearing, we met in a private room where Christy apologized to me. She expressed regret for her actions and emphasized that they didn't reflect her love for me. She apologized once more, saying she would regret it for the rest of her life. I responded, expressing my own regret, stating that I regretted the day I met her, proposed to her, and married her. I told her I was moving on. Christy acknowledged my decision, expressing her contempt for me and hoping that I would use my brain to make decisions rather than acting on impulses. I was choked up but fell silent, feeling more regretful about the situation than my decisions. I left the room, and we never spoke again or touched. It felt liberating. It was 3 months before I started going out again. I didn't intend to meet anyone, but I was tired of being at home. I went out with Chris, Hines, Liz, and Kim. They often introduced me to friends, hinting at matchmaking. While I wasn't ready for a serious relationship, I enjoyed socializing. I allowed myself to have carefree fun without attachment. They were all nice, but there was no spark, and when the night ended, so did our interactions. I also got into the habit of going out alone, finding comfort in solitude. The club was busy, but none of them were my responsibility, and I enjoyed that. One of the bartenders at the club, the same one where my life took a drastic turn, was Tasha, a woman I went to high school with. She had been working there for some time, although she wasn't present that night. You remember that night? We were barely acquaintances before, but on the nights I came in alone, we started to form what seemed like a friendship, and she hinted that she wanted more. One day, about 10 months after Christy had left the bar with those guys, I encountered them again. They were back in the club, likely with plans to repeat their scheme. At the moment, they were simply sitting, drinking, and scanning the room, probably scouting for targets. I assumed Tasha noticed me looking in their direction and asked about my interest. Why are you staring at Desmond and Richard?" she asked, catching my attention. Surprised that she knew their names, I turned back to her. She confirmed that they were regulars at the bar. I inquired if she was acquainted with them, to which she responded that she wasn't personally. When I mentioned that I thought they were from out of town and only visited occasionally for business, she corrected me, stating that they worked at a downtown supply warehouse near the freeway. I asked if they lived nearby, and she confirmed that they had been living nearby for years, though she didn't know exactly where. She explained that they often came to the bar to pick up women and were successful at it, mentioning that Richard was well endowed. I found her revelation about the bar being a popular spot for pickups surprising, but she seemed oblivious to my thoughts. I asked if they got many single women at the bar. Tasha replied that they did all right, mostly in groups, but the guys didn't limit themselves to single women. They seemed to prefer married ones. I tried not to show my anger at this revelation, expressing my concern. I commented that it sounded risky. Tasha reassured me, saying she doubted the husbands ever found out because the guys weren't the bragging type, and the wives typically kept quiet about it. She didn't seem bothered by the situation, seeing no damage in it. She reasoned that wives got to have some fun and husbands remained unaware, so it didn't damage them. She suggested that husbands might even benefit from the situation by receiving good guilt lovemaking. As I pondered her words, I realized that nothing would happen between us. If she was okay with others engaging in such behavior, she likely wouldn't hesitate to do it herself, which was unfortunate. Tasha continued talking when I didn't respond, mentioning an incident where the guys had tried to pick up a woman while her husband was in the club. It had turned into a big issue and almost became violent, so they hadn't tried it again. She recounted that the wife had even asked Victor to restrain the husband so she could leave with the guys. I turned back to her slowly, and she seemed to notice the expression on my face. She confirmed that Christy had indeed been involved in an affair. Suddenly, she seemed to put the pieces together and expressed her shock and apology, realizing the situation. She seemed at a loss for words. I got up from the bar and headed outside, feeling the need to distance myself from the conversation. As I did that, I quickly placed a phone call to kick things off, then settled outside to wait. I hadn't realized how much I craved revenge until I learned it was all a scam. Sure, Christy willingly accepted their invitation, and that wouldn't change, but I believe she did so thinking they were just a couple of out-of-towners seeking a fling, never to be seen again, somehow making it less wrong. I had singled out their car in the parking lot. Not to lean into a stereotype, but when I spotted the Cadillac with lowered suspension and flashy chrome rims, I was pretty sure it was theirs. Since they hadn't started their hunt yet, I figured I had time before they came out unless they got lucky early. I wasn't privy to what happened inside the club, but it was nearly an hour before they finally emerged, accompanied by a woman they had evidently charmed inside. I had guessed right about the car, and I leaned against the driver's side door as they approached. Hey man," said Desmond, the apparent spokesman, speaking up. "Mind taking your hands off my ride?" Ignoring him, I addressed their slightly intoxicated companion. As much as she might deserve whatever consequences came her way, I didn't want to witness damage befall a woman, especially one whose husband didn't deserve it either. "Oh yeah, I could see the wedding ring from here." In a tone that left no room for argument, I addressed her directly. "Sweetheart, you better find somewhere else to be, like maybe home with your husband, you know, the one you vowed to forsake all others for?" I wasn't sure what she did next, but after surveying the situation, she opted to heed my advice, disappearing back into the club despite Desmond and Richard's protests. Once she left, the men turned their annoyance toward me, questioning why I interfered with their plans. I calmly reminded them that the woman belonged to her husband. One of the men recognized me, recalling our previous encounter around 10 months ago. He realized that I was the husband of the woman who had asked him to hold back so she could join them. They inquired about her whereabouts, expressing interest in another encounter. I informed them that she had moved on since then. When they asked if we had split up, I responded that I had no interest in her after she had gone with them. They then questioned if I sought revenge. As they advanced toward me, their intentions became clear. They seemed to be focused solely on me, unaware of my friends closing in behind them. Suddenly, they found themselves restrained by 3 of my friends each. Despite their struggles, Hines and Rick were strong enough to overpower them, and soon they were kneeling with their arms bound behind their backs. Their confidence quickly diminished. One of them tried to justify their actions, stating that they had simply made an offer and the woman had willingly accepted. I responded that while I had been angry with her initially, my concern was now directed towards them and others like them who posed a threat to society. I was determined to ensure they never repeated such behavior. I instructed my friends to load them into Jed's pickup truck, where they secured the 2 individuals in case they attempted to escape. About an hour later, we arrived at a secluded area in the county, guided by Jed, whose family owned a nearby farm. We reached a large grove of trees, miles away from civilization and completely hidden from view. The guys hauled our captives out of the truck, showing little care. I relished the fear in their eyes. They probably never imagined that their pursuit of casual lovemaking would land them in this predicament. They were facing unforeseen consequences, much like Christy. So, with a light-hearted tone that hopefully disguised my seriousness, I pondered aloud. The best way to rid society of their carnivorous behavior. I expressed my thoughts on how to deal with them, mentioning the possibility of castration followed by release, which elicited horror from them. I pointed out the potential complications if they sought medical attention after such an act. They unanimously agreed on this point, though my friends Desmond and Richard remained silent. I then mentioned the alternative option of taking their lives to eliminate any witnesses. While Desmond appeared horrified, Richard's expression suggested he might prefer passing away over a life without his manhood. I commented on the absurdity of tying one's self-worth to the size of their gonads. Desmond attempted to defend their actions, claiming it was just lovemaking and that the woman might have been with other men before. I rebuffed him, stating that my concern was not with her anymore but with them. I emphasized my frustration with men like them who thought they could seduce married women without consequences. I believed it was time for them to learn a lesson and serve as an example to others. I signaled for the rest of the gang to join me in a private huddle nearby. The goal was simply to intimidate the creeps. Truthfully, I'm not a violent person, and as much as I wanted to hurt these guys, it wasn't my true intention, at least not permanently. We kept them on edge for about an hour, making them believe we had reconsidered taking their lives or maiming them. By the time we returned, their fight seemed to have drained away. I informed them that I had been persuaded by my friends not to resort to taking their lives or castrating them. Instead, I outlined the consequences they would face, a severe beating. I made it clear that we would provide each other with alibis but warned them that if any police inquiries were made, they would face the initial options. I emphasized that we would be monitoring them closely, having their addresses and workplaces from their driver's licenses. I issued a stern warning that if they ever targeted married women again, they would face severe consequences. Desmond inquired if there was any way to avoid the beating, to which I responded with a proposition. I suggested that they could avoid the punishment by engaging in a particular act. Desmond eagerly agreed to the proposal, hoping to avoid the beating. And they did receive their beating. With 10 of us, we vented some frustration on them. We made sure to avoid anything fatal, but there were definitely some broken bones. We avoided breaking ribs as they could puncture lungs. At the very least, they'll remember this for a long time. We drove them back to town and left them on the curb near a hospital, avoiding the parking lot and any security cameras. The next morning, we made headlines as 2 sufferers of an assault by unidentified assailants, possibly in a failed robbery. The cases went cold when the guys claimed not to recognize their attackers and believed it was a random incident. And here we are, a year after that dreadful night. Somehow, I managed not to become entirely distrustful of all women, but it hasn't been easy. Word has it that Christy recently met someone and they've started dating. It's early days, but apparently, it's promising. Desmond and Richard seem to have vanished. At least they're no longer working at the warehouse, and their apartments are empty. I suppose they're running their scheme in another city. Sometimes I wonder if I should have dealt with those 2 creeps more permanently. It crosses my mind often, and I sometimes regret the choice I made. Eventually, I had to find a new hangout spot. Tasha became more forward, and my polite refusals didn't dissuade her, so I finally had to tell her that nothing would happen between us. Since she saw nothing wrong with a wife cheating on her husband, she tried to convince me she wouldn't do that herself, but I simply didn't believe her. I'd rather get 2 dogs than date her. I haven't made any plans yet, but I'll eventually start dating again. Maybe. Maybe not.